Good evening. We're going to start our program now. Thanks for coming. Ordinarily, we have a larger live audience, but we find from time to time we have scheduling conflicts, and tonight we hit the mother load. 5 other programs at the same time. What we should have is program speed dating, where people can stay 5 minutes in one venue and then kind of revolve around. But until technology catches up with civility, we will have to do with what we've got. So I'm Sylvia Shulkin, first Vice President of the League of Women Voters of Falmouth and chair of our steering committee. I'm also a member of the Falmouth League's Voter Service Committee, which is presenting this program tonight, under the very capable direction of the Voter Service Chair, Carol McKeon. Kudos to all of the Voter Service members, including Alice Carey, Marcy Easterling, Judy Fenwick, Olive Ann Hobby, Misty Niemeyer, Jenny Putnam, Judy Stetson, Joanne Treestman, and Olivia White. We're very pleased that this program is being taped by FCTV, our town's cable TV station. Our thanks to Bob Fenstermaker, Director of Operations for FCTV, and to the FCTV crew for their valuable work. The program will be broadcast on FCTV over the next few weeks on a schedule that will appear in the Enterprise. As many of you here know, the League is a nonpartisan political organization of men and women which encourages informed, active participation in government. Yes, the League is open to men and women. So we hope that you men in the audience who haven't yet joined this exclusive group will consider joining. How can the League claim to be nonpartisan and political at the same time? Well, we're nonpartisan because we never support a candidate or a party in an election. But we're political because we do advocate for certain policies after we study an issue, discuss the facts, and reach consensus on a position. We've been doing this work for a long time. 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the League's founding on the national and Massachusetts levels and the passage of the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote. And by the way, the League was founded before the 19th Amendment was passed. And we're celebrating in style. Coming up will be a guest lecture by Elaine Weiss, who's a prize-winning author of The Women's Hour, which is about the suffrage movement. And that will be sponsored with Falmouth Forum. We're also going to have a showing of the film Iron-Jawed Angels with a very stellar cast, and that will be at a date to be announced. In addition, we're planting 10 tupelo trees in a centennial garden at Peterson Farm, and that was created with the approval of town government. You can participate in this event by contributing $50 or more if you can to pay for the trees. We have to order them at the beginning of December. We need to raise this money now or we simply won't have a garden. Please see our November League Bulletin online for a contribution form. You can also buy one or more tupelo trees for yourself, for your own home, or as a gift for someone who appreciates beautiful, hardy, native trees. The issues that the League studies and the policies for which we advocate can be matters of local, state, or nationwide importance. Tonight, our focus is decidedly national. The League's nationwide effort to counter gerrymandering, a movement, if you want to call it that started in Massachusetts. It's a maneuver by legislators to draw election districts within a state so that the district lines give one party a majority of the voters in many districts, concentrating the voter strength of the other party into as few districts as possible. Another gerrymandering strategy is to scatter voters, draw the district lines in such a way that voters who oppose the majority party are scattered through the state so that they never constitute a majority in any district. One wag summed up gerrymandering as politicians picking voters rather than voters picking politicians. By the way, gerrymandering was first employed back in 1812, and Elbridge, he was known then as Elbridge Gerry, but we got lazy and we started using the soft G 100 years later. Elbridge Gerry became our 5th vice president. He didn't last long. He died after about a year and a half in office, but he certainly left his footprint on our political life. Ultimately, in the 1860s, as I said before, Gerry was corrupted into Jerry, and that's a fitting tribute to the first elected official to give official approval to this corrupt practice. We're very fortunate tonight to have as our presenter Judy Zornbrecher, the co-president of the Massachusetts League of Women Voters. Judy has distinguished herself as a leader wherever she's gone, first in the corporate world as the vice president of research and development at Welch's. They are the people who bring you the jam and other fine products for which I'm being paid. And she was a research and development manager and executive at SC Johnson and Procter & Gamble. Judy holds degrees in biochemistry and chemical engineering from Rice University. So how lucky are we then to have Judy here tonight? And the fact that she followed her retirement by joining the League and quickly becoming a leader is the League's very good fortune. Judy's a member of the Concord Carlisle League, where she has held a number of leadership positions. And as the co-president of the League now, she's in a very demanding position. It would be demanding at any time, but now especially as the state and national leagues celebrate their centenaries and we have a national election coming up. Judy will discuss what the League is doing throughout the country to fight gerrymandering so that all citizens not only have the right to vote, but to cast a vote that counts. And that'll be time for questions after Judy's presentation. Judy. Oh, that's right.
Thank you, Sylvia. And I see the first thing I need to do is get my presentation under control. So I don't know if I did something or what has happened here. So let me take a moment, get myself back, I hope, to where I need to be. Oops. Okay, here we go. Yeah. Okay, there we go. I'm going to put this down here so I don't do whatever I did again. Good evening, everyone. So pleased to be here to talk about redistricting and specifically the League of Women Voters National Campaign on the people-powered fair maps. Now, I will be honest, I'm going to say people-powered fair maps a few more times, but it is a mouthful, and I will probably start talking about redistricting, but it's the same thing as the people-powered fair maps is the campaign that we have from the National League, and the Massachusetts League is participating in this campaign. So, as we move forward, I thought as we go through tonight, the first thing is to talk about what is the people-powered fair maps, how do we redistrict, when does it happen from a national level, and then talk about what the standards are that the League has for redistricting to make it fair, how we do it in Massachusetts, what the State League is planning to do to participate in this campaign, and then some ideas and opportunities for all of you, whether you're League members or not, to contribute and participate in this campaign. So first of all, People-Powered Fair Maps campaign is to create a fair and transparent people-powered redistricting processes to eliminate partisan and racial gerrymandering in all states. So it is both the racial and the partisan gerrymandering that we're looking to get rid of, and we're doing it by putting in place processes that are powered by the people. And as Sylvia mentioned, we want the voters to pick their representatives, not have the representatives pick their voters, which unfortunately has become very predominant over, certainly in 2011. It's happened throughout history, but it seems to have really taken on a new edge in the last time around. And we want to do this because if we don't have a democracy that is representative of the people, we all lose faith in government, and it's just not what we need to do to defend our democracy and make our country strong. So this is really core to what we do as a league to defend our democracy and empower voters, to make sure that they're fairly represented. So redistricting is a once-in-a-decade opportunity. And once those are set, assuming they're set legally and not challenged, that's what the districts will be for the next 10 years for Congress, and also many times for your state legislature, the Senate and the House, and possibly for a lot of local districts that are drawn in cities or in your school districts, or let's see, we have our Governor's Council that has districts that are set based upon this. So it's a very, very important process to pay attention to in the timing. So we are coming up on it because the very first step is the 2020 census that enumerates everybody who lives in the United States. It doesn't matter if you're here as a citizen, whether you're here legally or illegally, it is to enumerate everybody who lives in the United States. The census data is used for many different things, including determining how many representatives in the House of Representatives each state gets. Each state gets at least one, and there currently are 7 states that only have enough population to have one representative, a state like Delaware, Wyoming, I believe Idaho. So there are some states, Alaska, that only have one representative. But the rest of us, they take the population and they divide it by 435, because that's how many representatives there are in the House, and that determines how many representatives our state or a state will have. So for instance, in 2011, Massachusetts went from 10 representatives to 9 representatives because our population did not grow as fast as the remaining part of the rest of the country did. So it's very important that the count is done fully and accurately so that the apportionment is done accurately and reflects who is living in those states and in the districts and where in the state they are living, because that has an impact also on redistricting. So the census is Census Day, I believe, is April 1st. It will run from about April 1st to probably, I believe it's around June or July. They're going to be seeking to wrap it up. And then they get all the information in. It starts getting sorted and reviewed. There will be a lot of watching to make sure that it is enumerated accurately, because there can be issues potentially if it's, even though you collected the information, that it's enumerated correctly. And then by law, the Census Bureau must provide to each of the states by the end of the year, so December 31st of 2021, they will provide to the states, here's how many people live in your state, here are all the maps, and they will also tell the states how many representatives they have. Based upon that information, then starting, it's in December 2020, they get the information. And typically around the springtime of 2021, certainly this is how it works in has worked in Massachusetts, the redistricting starts up. And then the states go about determine how the districts are set at the congressional, at the state levels, usually ending up in November of the 2021, and then that's when that is published, leading into the elections that would occur the following year. So it is a 3-step process. The census is an integral part of this redistricting process, in addition to the process of actually drawing the maps. So the rules, there are rules that govern how things are redistricted. There's rules at the federal level. And a couple rules are, one rule specifically is in the U.S. Constitution. And the U.S. Constitution says, you states do it. The only thing the federal government provides is how many, your population, how many seats you get. After that, the Constitution said this is dealt with by the states. However, over the years, there have been Supreme Court cases, and specifically the cases that related to how do you draw the districts. And the Supreme Court has weighed in and said you have to have strict equal population for your districts. And that is generally judged by, you can have no more of a difference than 1% between the highest and the lowest population in any of your congressional districts in a state. If you're beyond that bound, you're likely going to get challenged and probably are going to be told to go back and redraw your maps. At the state level, there were cases back in the 1960s that the League actually participated in that said that rule applies to state districts also. Although there is a little bit more leeway, it's generally accepted that you have about a 10% band around your population from one district to the next. So that is built on the principle of, one person, one vote, equal representation of your vote in terms of how your districts are drawn. So that's what the federal government says in terms of how the districts are drawn from population. And then there is the Voting Rights Act that makes it illegal to racially gerrymander and to put a racial group or an ethnic group at a disadvantage. However, it does allow for majority-minority districts to ensure minority populations do have a voice in the congressional delegation, and there are components that you have to apply for to make sure that the government agrees that that is the appropriate path to take. We do have one majority-minority district in Massachusetts, and that's the 2nd Congressional District. So, back to what the states do. This gives you a map. This is from Ballotpedia, which, by the way, I find is a very good source to get an idea as to what's going on, what the history is in various states, that shows the different ways that maps are drawn in different states. So they range all the way from a combination of methods that currently is in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Missouri and Arkansas. And what that means is that they may have a commission to do, say, state districts, but say the legislature does congressional districts. So they kind of mix and match different approaches to get to their districts. There are a number of states now that have independent commissions. Those tended to have been put in place because the citizens put ballot initiatives and said, we want an independent commission. That's what happened in Arizona, Colorado, in Michigan recently, and they're now moving towards that in Ohio, although there's some court challenges around that. And that is clearly what we consider the gold standard, is having an independent commission to draw the maps. Some other states have politically appointed commissions. The League does not prefer those because those can be skewed based on who is in power. But there can be ways potentially to set them up so that they are fair representation. And you can see there's a number of states up in the Pacific Northwest, New York and New Jersey have those type of commissions. All the rest of us, about 34 states, do it by state legislature. The state legislature gets to define what the process is, execute the process, and vote on the maps. And sometimes the governor can veto them, sometimes not. It depends on what the state laws are. So you can see there's a lot of variation on how maps are drawn, and there's also a lot of room in there for different rules to be used to draw the maps. Hence, we see a need at the League to get in place processes that are fair, powered by the people, are open and transparent, and meet standards in terms of fairness of representation. So why did we embark on this? This has been an issue for a while. Clearly, starting in 2011, it was seen as a big issue. Starting in 2011, when some of the maps were published, like in North Carolina, Pennsylvania, other states like that, the state leagues jumped into action. And they went all the way from, in Pennsylvania, they went through their court system, the state court system, to get a ruling to overturn the gerrymandered map in Pennsylvania. The other path that was taken in terms of lawsuits was in North Carolina and also in Maryland. They had gerrymandered maps also. And that was to take it into the federal courts to get the federal courts to rule partisan gerrymandering is illegal. That went to the Supreme Court, and in June of this year, the ruling came down from the Supreme Court as a 5-4 ruling. They said, this is a political issue. There are no standards that we can see to be able to make this judgment from a federal standpoint, unlike racial gerrymandering where there are standards. They said, we have no jurisdiction over this. You need to sort it out in your states. Clearly, since the League was a co-plaintiff in that suit, they would be polite, they were disappointed. Clearly, I think outrage might be another term that was used. But anyway, it was like, really disappointed. And then it was like, okay, but we can't stop here. And the league, the National League said, we've got to do something. Leagues around the country have been working on this. This is critical to our democracy. We have strong positions in terms of the right way to redistrict, in terms of redistricting process. We're going to do a national campaign to get the right process in place. So the disappointment was to turn them out into action based upon successes that had occurred on a state-by-state level in terms of lawsuits, getting ballot initiatives approved, and working with some state legislatures. And that's the basis upon which this campaign was developed. But it does have to be on a state-by-state basis. We can no longer rely on the federal courts to rule on this. So why the League? We all know the League is nonpartisan. Republicans will gerrymander, Democrats will gerrymander. Politicians will gerrymander because they want to keep their jobs. And the best way to keep their jobs is to keep the voters who got them in office in their districts. And so we are nonpartisan. We do not support political candidates or parties. So we are nonpartisan. It's core to our Make Democracy Work campaign. It has been up as part of that campaign for a very long time, so we're simply elevating this to a nationwide campaign. It's been a priority issue. I mentioned that in the 60s, the League was involved in the lawsuits that set the standard that state districts, legislative districts, need to be of about equal population with a plus or minus 10% band. So it is something that we have a long history with. We have very well-defined positions on this. And as you all know, the League takes actions only after we've studied an issue and we've come to consensus on what the position is that we can then base our education and advocacy work from. We also have a presence in every single state and the District of Columbia. The League is set up to be a grassroots organization, or an organization that, yes, we have 3 levels, but we really started at the local league level, and we work things with the state, and we have a federal level. But we've got people on the ground. I know our legislative advocacy person at the state league, a volunteer like I am, she said that she's had legislators tell her they listen when the League comes and talks, because they know the League is not just a list of names. They know the League is actual people who belong to the organization who do go and advocate. So we've got the feet on the ground. We've got leagues in all 50 states. We have people very interested and involved in this. And we've all signed up. Every single state in the District of Columbia has signed up for this. We've had wins at state level, which I've mentioned already. And it's also a campaign that will be grounded in both social justice and racial equality, because we are going for both partisan gerrymandering and also to eliminate racial gerrymandering. The other thing which I didn't put up here, but it also kind of played into it, is you think about 100 years ago, the women finally won the right to vote because the campaign was taken down to the state level. It was a state-by-state battle. And that's what Elaine Rice will talk about, is that final battle in Tennessee to get the Tennessee legislature to approve the 19th Amendment. So it takes us back to our history. It takes us back to our history of working on a state-by-state basis and to persist and to make movement and to move us into a better democracy in terms of representation. So what is our position on redistricting the League? And this is from the National League position. The gold standard that we would put out there is that the best way to do redistricting is to have an independent commission that reflects the diversity of the community, lead the effort, and to draw the maps. That is the gold standard. And you'll see as we go through, and then also as we discuss in Massachusetts, sometimes we can't get to that gold standard, but there are also many other elements that we can ensure are included in the process that it can at least start moving us to something that is fair and independent. In terms of the process, it kind of, anybody who's worked in any area will know, a process really needs to have defined steps and timing. Who's going to do what? How's it going to be done? And when can we expect this? A lot of redistricting processes are behind closed doors, and then all of a sudden one day you see in a newspaper, here are the maps. You had no idea they were coming. You didn't know how to get information into it. But we say, from our point of view, a defined process with steps and timing, having full disclosure in public hearings under open meeting law so that the public can be there. The public can hear what is said, what are the considerations, what are people saying in terms of their interest in maps, and also for the public to give their point of view. in terms of what they think is appropriate and want to see in terms of the maps, and then make sure that their interests are reflected as they are drawn. We also believe that the plan should not be adopted by a simple majority of, say, the legislature, if that's who's going to vote on it, because that can also lead to partisan gerrymandering. So it's best if it can be something that is more than a simple majority that says, yes, this is the right map, because that means that you've worked across the parties to ensure that it is fair and representative. And that there needs to be remedial provisions established so that if the map does come out and it hasn't been a good process and it is unfair, that there is a way for the people in that state to challenge that map. So those are some of the elements. Goes on, there's some other things. It needs to be enforceable in court in terms of the map being drawn or any decisions that are made. And then there are requirements. Certainly we talked about from the federal level, it needs to be substantially equal population. But many states have in their rules, their laws, for instance, that, and this is best practices also, there needs to be contiguous maps. You can't have one spot here and 20 miles away another spot here. They need to be connected together. Now, unfortunately, you look at some of the most gerrymandered maps in the country, and you will see it is simply a road, that lengthy road that is connecting two maps together, and it looks like either a barbell, or I think there's one out of Illinois, it looks like a set of earmuffs. So there's way politicians, people can play with that, but they need to be contiguous. They need to be effective representative of both racial and linguistic minorities in the groups. They also should promote partisan fairness and also preservation and protectors of communities of interest. And one way to think about that is I saw a map one time out of California, and California has a pretty good redistricting process. But if you look at some of the one of the maps in California, and I believe this is for a congressional district, it kind of hugs the coast. And I looked at that, and it's kind of long. It's along the coast. It's kind of like, well, that looks like that's gerrymandered. But then I was talking with someone else about it, and there is a community of interest there. You live on the coast. You're going to have different interests than if you live up in the mountains. And certainly if you live in the mountains, you're probably worried about wildfires and things like that. Living on the coast, you might be more concerned about what is being done around protection of that coastline. So you can have different communities of interest, whether they are business or they're ecological, where your schools are located. So those are important to make sure that those are understood in terms of giving people who have different interests their voice in our government. And within Massachusetts, this is important, and we also believe that this is important nationwide, is that you should preserve municipal and county boundaries. So your sub-political units, your smaller units, should be pulled together. In Texas, Austin, huge city, also very liberal for city. Any place in the country would be considered liberal. And it is represented by 4 different congressmen or congresspersons, because they took Austin, they took its population, and they cut it into 4 spots. That is not a good practice. You've now taken the people of Austin, and I would say their voice has been significantly diluted because they are not the major population for a representative in Congress. So that would be something that from a league standpoint, we would say that is not a best practice, that's not a fair way to draw that. And if possible, they should be compact and competitive, but it shouldn't be done at the expense of above criteria. And there's 2 things I heard. There's a group at Tufts University in the Tisch School for Civic Life, I believe it's called. It's the Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering group. Really interesting. There's a bunch of mathematicians. And if you're really interested, you can look at their website. They publish papers. They've got a little tool in there that you can play around with maps if you want to start drawing your own maps that they encourage people to look at if you want to give input. But I heard someone speak from that group one time, because we all think, well, they should be just like, the boundaries around maps should be just really compact. These things that have little lines and stuff coming out, they are by definition bad. And this person showed that that's not always the case. In fact, you can get even more gerrymandered maps or unrepresentative maps by using only compactness as your only criteria. So one needs to be careful in thinking about that. In fact, that was when she was also showing us that map of California with the district that went along the coast, in terms of that was an important community of interest. The other part around competitiveness, because that gets into, well, shouldn't there be a standard to say, based upon the voters in this area, we need to make sure we've got races that are considered competitive. Different groups go in and take a look at, how competitive are these districts. they just put out a paper I think about a month ago, that looks at Massachusetts, in fact, and it was on the Massachusetts State Senate. There's 40 districts in Massachusetts. And one of the concerns in Massachusetts is, are the maps gerrymandered to underrepresent Republicans that live in the state? Because I don't know what the population, but anyway, it looks like they could be underrepresented. So they went retrospectively, and they can run all these different models very quickly on their computers. So they generated all these different models, and they looked retrospectively at if the Republicans voted exactly as they did for Scott Brown when he won the Senate race, with any of these, with the maps, that one optimized to perhaps increase Republican representation in a normal election year, the Republicans would have ended up with fewer districts than what the current maps would give them. So one needs to be careful about, I think, setting up algorithms, that was my take from this paper, to lead to what you consider competitive today or based upon past election results. You might actually not deliver against that. And the other is that you need to be cautious about, once you've put an algorithm in place, there are going to be a bunch of smart people who are partisan who are going to figure out how to game that system. So there's a lot of interesting literature out there about, do you put competitiveness standards, measurable standards and methods in place? Is that really a good practice or not? So that's why, from a league standpoint, they should be compact, they should be competitive, but these other criteria are much more important, we believe, for fair maps. What we do explicitly reject is drawing a district to make sure that you have the current representative's address in there. That's, I believe it is in Maryland. That was the case that was brought in Maryland about the Sarbanes district. It was allegedly drawn, that was what was in the suit. It was allegedly drawn to include his home address so he could continue to be representative of that area. So we explicitly reject that as a criteria. And then, of course, preferential treatment for any political party, which is a lot of what happened in 2011 in terms of using really deep data that now is available about, unfortunately, all of this online, to draw maps based upon how you voted, where you live, what clubs you belong to, what newspapers you read. It was just amazing, apparently, all the information they pulled together to pull maps together to make them very partisan. So we reject those two things. They should not be part of any redistricting process. So with that as background in terms of how it works, what the issues are, the league, as I said, determined that this needs to be done state by state, but it is also determined that each state has their own needs and their own political climate, and it's up to the state leagues working with national to say, this is the strategy and approach we want to work on. So for instance, if we go to California, which already has an independent redistricting commission, their approach is going to be making sure it continues to work, right, because you always have to keep an eye on it, but also then to take those ideas of independent redistricting and start pushing them down into lower levels of government, because they are not necessarily being enacted like at city council level, et cetera. So that's one approach. And also they're going to be going after and advocating for federal legislative fixes. Whereas other states, such as I know in Illinois, Oregon just filed a ballot initiative that is being led by, amongst other groups, the League of Women Voters of Oregon, and in Oklahoma, they're going to go after, and they're starting on ballot initiatives and referendums to take it to the voters to have them vote on it. When that was done in a number of other states, such as in Arizona, it was like 65 or 70% of the population voted for independent commissions. So all the evidence is that when it's put to the voters say, yes, we want an independent commission. But so some states, based upon their political climate, are going the ballot initiative or referendum route. State constitutional options are such as what was done in Pennsylvania. Take a look at the state constitution and see if there's a way in terms of what's in your state constitution about having a fair vote, being a fair vote and representation as a basis for a lawsuit against gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering. So there's some states that believe from their state constitutional standpoint that is an avenue to go through the courts and force to have fair maps presented and drawn in their states. State legislative fixes is similar to what some of the work we'll be doing in Massachusetts, which is where the state legislature is still running the process. but working and advocating to ensure that it is an open process, it's a well-defined process, and it meets all the criteria as best as possible that outlined from the national standpoint. And then the federal legislative fixes, which we will also be participating in, is advocating for the passage in the Senate, the presentation and passage in the Senate of For the People Act, which is H.R. 1, which has passed the House. It's a very broad act that really addresses and helps improve our voting. It also has a large portion in there about redistricting in terms of process, monies to help do that, and so advocating for that, and also advocating for reenactment of the Voting Rights Act, which has had a core provision of it gutted by the Supreme Court back, I think, in 2014. It needs to be reenacted so that it can really get back to what its intent is, which is to protect the voting rights of everybody in the country. So each state chooses its individual approach, and I don't know what all 50 approaches are. I know, some are doing I've mentioned about the ones on ballot initiatives. North Carolina, talk about people doing yeoman's work there. They are doing lawsuits at the state level. I talked to the woman who's literally going around the state doing education forums on redistricting and telling people why this is important for you. No matter what your party is, this is important. She said she goes to places and then she kind of goes back to them later on, hopefully to gin up some interest. She said the one county she went to, the first time she went to, she had like 3 people in the audience. But one of them was the Republican chair of that county. After the presentation, he came up and said, I like what you said. I think that is appropriate. I would like to work with you to further get that word out. So she went to some other places and she came back about 6 months later, and through his connections, he convinced about another 25 people to come to her presentation. So sometimes you can find interesting partners in terms of helping get the word out overall. But so that's a state that's doing civic education in addition to lawsuits and working with the legislature to get things changed and through. I know in New Jersey, they started off a campaign. They've actually brought in some of the people from California who are on their independent redistricting commission to give, again, forums around the state to tell the people in New Jersey, this is what you should expect from that political appointed committee that you now have in place. And so they're doing both education, and then we'll use that as a way to then for citizens to advocate with their state representatives and with the state legislature to make sure it's a fair process. So those are the type of things that different groups are doing. Alaska, they only have 1 congressional district, so it's pretty easy, but they do have state districts. They're doing a program with the schools to educate kids and having a project where the kids will be looking at all these different factors and drawing maps. So that's another way to get the word out and do some advocacy. So it's really interesting to talk to people about how they're approaching it. The other thing that we're looking to do is in every single state is to find partners to work with. And it's not only partners who are like strongly supportive of what we're doing, an organization like Common Cause, for instance, who we do a lot of partnering with. But it's also looking at the spectrum and saying, who are the groups that we think are persuadable, that are maybe 50% in agreement with them? You're reaching out to them and bringing them on board. So we're really looking to broaden our reach by actively partnering with people. The key criteria is that it cannot be a partisan group. It cannot be a group that has the agenda and does state that they are here to get more Democrats or more Republicans elected if you only work with that group. So those are the criteria. So we're really looking to reach out and expand how we approach this. So that's what's going on at the national level. So the question is, well, why in Massachusetts are we not advocating for an independent commission? That would be wonderful to have. It would it certainly, I believe, would give people a lot more confidence in the state about how our districts are drawn. However, the political climate as we assessed it in the state was not one that was conducive to taking that tact now, especially since in 2011 it is generally seen that the process that was done in Massachusetts was a fair and open process through what the legislature set up. So as we look at where we want to expend our energy and have the biggest bang for the buck, we felt continuing to work with the legislature and educating the population on the process and working with groups like Common Cause to ensure the same type of process is used again in 2020 was a much better use of our resources. So we can do things such as focus on making sure the 2020 census is accurate and helping advocate for changes at the national level. So just a little bit of background from Massachusetts. Our rules are, in addition to the national rules, that the districts need to be contiguous, need to be equal number of inhabitants, and they are very specific about not splitting counties, cities, or towns if possible, and no town with less than 2,500 people should be split. If you look at the state statute, you can see a few other things, but that's kind of generally what is in there overall. So how it went in 2011, after a disastrous 2001 redistricting where Speaker Finneran pled guilty to obstruction of justice. That was not clearly an open and honest process. The state really turned around, and the legislature really put in place a process that was very open. So it started off with, after receiving the data from the Census Bureau, the Joint Redistricting Commission was created by the legislature, and Stan Rosenberg was the chair from the Senate side, and I'm drawing the blank on the fellow from the Republican side who chaired it. It had 28 members, and they pulled together a process. They had 13 they laid out their process and the timing, had 13 public meetings that they held between 2011 to June 2011. So there was plenty of opportunity for people to observe and provide input and testimony around how the district should be drawn. Apparently all the Congress, members of Congress who were in Congress at that time, they got to speak why they felt their district should remain the same. And some of it's interesting if you look back at the report. Some of it does, things interesting to think about. People who've been members of Congress for a long time would say, like Markey, who was a representative, he's Senator Markey now, but he was representative back then. He says, listen, I've been in Congress for a long time. I've worked my way up to places of power on committees, and I know how things work. It's important for me to remain in Congress to help represent Massachusetts. That's a legitimate point. So it's interesting to read about all the different things that were considered as these districts were, the testimony given, and how these districts were determined overall. The maps were released at least 2 weeks before they were voted on. They ranged anywhere from October to November, depending on which map it was. And then by the late November, they were approved and signed by the governor. Part of what drives our timing in Massachusetts is that, I believe it is in the state constitution, if you're in the House in our state legislature, you have to have lived in your district for at least 1 year prior to the election. So therefore, the state maps need to be agreed to on at least the state district level, the state house district level, 1 year before the following year's election. Otherwise, you'd have chaos in terms of whether you can run for that district or not. The Senate, interesting, state Senate does not have that requirement. The state Senate says you simply have to have been a resident of the state of Massachusetts for 5 years prior to the election. So anyway, there's some interesting little things in there that one learns as you start reading through all this stuff. So that's what our current process, that's what the process was in 2011. We are going to be looking to advocate to do that process and help league members and other people participate in the process to get their voice heard. So our plan, our action plan in Massachusetts, really 3 major components. The 2020 census, which I've mentioned, is to ensure that we have a complete count across the state on that, and make sure that the process is transparent and public when we go into redistricting next year, and then advocate for passage of key federal legislation to ensure fair maps are drawn. So what can you do? We all can do something. Can go all the way from calling your representative to talking to a neighbor about the 2020 census, write a letter to the editor, all the way to forming a committee. But here's some ideas on the 2020 census. Ensure in your community that there is a complete count. Groups that are actually traditionally undercounted. You want to look at a lot of really interesting information. Look at the U.S. Census Bureau website. They've got a fact finder there where you can go into your specific community and you can find out what is, how good was Falmouth in 2010 on responding to the census. And when I looked at Falmouth, it was pretty good. It was about had a fairly low non-response rate. But you can look at the statistics and some groups that they're concerned about this year being undercounted. First of all, children under the age of 6 are traditionally undercounted. For some reason, people forget that they have children living in their household. Oh, you want to count the baby that was born last year? Yes, you do. So, making sure people know that. The other is that this is going to be the first year where this is going to be done online. On April 1st, we're all going to be encouraged to get on our computers or go to a computer at a library or some other place and fill in our census form. And one of the areas that the U.S. Census Bureau is concerned about undercounting is older people who may not be either have a computer or comfortable with a computer. So that's another group. Students, especially college students, are traditionally undercounted because they kind of are moving during this whole process. You may be down in Florida going to school when the census count starts, but then you're back home here for the summer. People in the military are another group. So there's very specific groups that are seen as concerns about being counted. So that's what complete counties or count committees are doing. The best place to get started is look in your own local community. In Concord, we started with our town clerk. We talked to our town clerk to get an idea of her assessment because they're already starting to think about this. They've been providing information to the Secretary of the Commonwealth in terms of what the precincts are, and they're a good place to start. They may have already started a complete count committee, but anybody can start a complete count committee, and there's information on how to do that on the Census Bureau. So that's one way, is to make sure there's a complete and accurate count. You also can look at groups like Mass Counts if you want to help in a gateway community where there's a lot of immigrants, because there is concern this year, given the controversy about whether there's going to be a citizenship question on there or not, plus other concerns about security, that there's a concern that there might be immigrants who will not participate in the census because of that. And again, the Census Bureau has a lot of information around security, that the information cannot be traced back to your specific name and address. So there's a lot of information that needs to get out. The other thing that needs to get out in terms of understanding kind of goes the other way. The other concern is a lot of scammers. With the census coming up, there could be people calling up like they pretend to be the IRS. So getting information out to people that if somebody calls up and says they're from the U.S. Census Bureau and they start asking for your Social Security number, a credit card, things like that, they are not with the Census Bureau. So there's a lot of different elements that we all can do to help us understand how it works and then educate our neighbors in our community, maybe even working with the libraries, for instance, on this. Other thing you can do is contact your U.S. Senator or representative in Congress about passing these key pieces of legislation. Another one that's starting to work through is giving the District of Columbia statehood. They still don't have statehood. They have no representation in Congress. That in many ways is a redistricting issue. And then advocate, talk to your state reps about making sure that the redistricting process is open and fair. Ask them questions. What do they know about it? How do they think about it? What do they think the criteria should be? If you have candidate forums, I think there's an open seat in the Senate coming up. You might want to ask some questions of the people who are running. What do they know about this and how do they think it should be done? So there's ways that you can get your voice heard with our representatives. If you're not a league member, join the league. If you are a league member, from the Massachusetts standpoint, if you contact us and want to join, we're starting up a census group. We're going to have a Google group to share information across the state on what various communities are doing, leagues are doing to help promote the census. And then we're going to be pulling together a toolkit for people to tap into and use. So we're starting up a group at the state league level of volunteers to assist in that. We're going to be advocating, learning how to advocate for the redistricting process. We're going to start off with, in February and March, a couple of webinars. First, in terms of how districts are drawn in the state of Massachusetts. And then we're going to seek to get someone who was actually on the redistricting commission in 2011 to talk about specifically what the process was back then for Massachusetts. And then we're going to follow up with a webinar to organize ourselves as league volunteers on how we want to train ourselves to observe the meetings, give input at the meetings, talk to our state legislatures about it. So we're starting that program up to be prepared for in 2021 when this process starts. Many leagues, I don't know if Falmouth has it, I know our league has it, many leagues have observer corps, which is you go to the local government meetings, and they're a great way to make sure that you do have good, open, fair government. And I know that's a pretty popular thing to do in my league. So this is kind of a similar thing of going and watching and reporting back on what happened. and then helping organize advocacy for key legislation, federal legislation, either by, say, getting a group together and writing postcards to representatives on key things at key points in time, because a lot of times we'll get action alerts from nationals saying, hey, write a letter to your representative in Congress because this vote is coming up. And even if you know your representative is already in favor of it, I've heard from a number of government, elected officials, they say it helps to continue to hear from people who are supportive of it, because they say the people who are opposed to it, they are very vocal. And if you go into a chamber and you give a speech and you can show either a stack of postcards, or you can say, I've had X hundred people or whatever from my district call up and say they want this, that helps get their point across. That gets the point across. The people in the state are supportive of these things. So even when we know they support this, it helps for them to continue to hear from us. So I think that's all I have. That's the email address if you're interested in volunteering at the state level. Send an email, and trust me, it'll get to me. I'm sorry, I should have watched my time more closely, but hopefully so I think there's a question back here.
The Supreme Court refused to take the case
Mm-hmm.
about gerrymandering. The Supreme Court refused to take the case about gerrymandering, so why does it work to do it at the state level?
Well, the Supreme Court actually took the case, and they ruled the federal government has no role in the partisan gerrymandering problem.
Well, they
So
said
they pushed it down to the state.
well, they said it was political. Well, it's still political at the state level, too.
It's still political at the state level, but because in Pennsylvania, they took it to the state court system, and it was based on the state constitution, the Supreme Court and the federal courts have no jurisdiction over that. So once they got the ruling at the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, that was it. They had no further way that they could go in terms of the appeal. Yeah.
I have been asked in various online petitions to say I'm in favor of having prisoners counted in their own homes rather than in prisons as in Concord.
Right, yes. And that is an ongoing issue. My understanding, I haven't gotten into detail about it, so the Census Bureau only counts prisoners at where they are right now. So the only data they have from the Census Bureau is, in Concord, even though they may have a home residence someplace else. So part of it is a problem of how the Census Bureau counts, enumerates the people, because we do not have the official data in terms of what a prisoner's home address is. And that's going to be a problem in this census also.
So that's true nationally.
That's true nationally, yes.
The League has no position on whether we should agitate for having...
Oh, no, the League has a position. We believe that the prisoners should be counted where they live. Not in the prison, but where they lived. But that is not going to unfortunately happen in this census. That's something at the federal level that, in addition to better funding for the U.S. Census Bureau, the League advocates for. And if those type of issues come forward for us to write letters, et cetera, we will make sure that that gets pushed out to the League membership.
Hey, as they say, hearing no questions.
I've looked at the district map for our state. It doesn't look that bad.
Yeah, that's...
I guess what we want to make sure is that it will continue to look good.
Yes, that's why we took the approach we took, which was the process worked well in 2011. The work that's been done by this geometric gerrymandering group found that both at the congressional level and at the Senate level that they were not gerrymandered from a partisan standpoint, definitely. And so, yeah, I mean, that's kind of my assessment, and assessment of what I've read of other groups like Common Cause and, you know, really pretty much across the board. It is frustrating. I know when I was on the radio on Tuesday morning, there was, you know, a call or a comment about, you know, gee, I'm always frustrated because I know that, you know, an independent or Republican is never going to win in my district. And I could see the frustration. Redrawing the districts is probably not going to solve that person's frustration. The people at the gerrymandering group, the headline on one of their papers around the congressional districts, it says there are as many congressional maps as there are stars in the sky that you could draw from Massachusetts, and they all are going to come back with current voting patterns as a Democratic representation. So I think that's, you know, so I concur with you. That's what it seems to be.
If census is going to be done on computers, how do you verify? You're not going to have census workers going to a home and talking to people, or is that going to be follow-up? Because you could go on and say you have 10 children and you have, you know, I mean,
Yeah.
seriously, it's going to be done on computers?
The initial round is going to try to get as much of as many of the people to do it on computers as possible. Then they will go and start on follow-up, which will include follow-up phone calls, and then people going door to door. They've got couple special groups that go into what they call group living situations, so that is going to college campuses and going to prisons. And this is where you really need to talk to somebody from the Census Bureau. Apparently they do have a way, because we asked the question, said, well, what if, you know, I go down and I answer the question and my husband, unbeknownst to me, answers it also. How do you sort that out? And apparently somehow in the magic of IT, they know how to do that. I can't tell you how it's done, but they've thought that through. We had someone, we're actually on December, I want to get the right date, December 5th, that's a Thursday, the State League is having a webinar with a Census Bureau specialist. It'll be from 2 to 3. You can sign up for it. We're sending it out. We're sending it out on Facebook, Twitter, and through our newsletters. And the specialist will address and talk to those type of questions. So I encourage you, if you want to learn more about the census, if you can, to sign up for the webinar that we're going to have.
No one then will be mailed a census form as in the past?
Ask the specialist that. I can't guarantee. I don't think so, but I don't want to answer a question.
Yeah. So then I was wondering, if there is no census form, would there be some kind of a reminder that people need to go online to do it?
Yes, my understanding is that there'll be certainly publicity campaign going up, and that there will be mailings to people to go online, how to go online. So those type of instructions will be sent to people, and then there will be follow-up reminders by phone and by mail. And then they'll be starting to get to the door-to-door enumerators. What I don't know is whether they send a form by mail or not. That part I'm not sure about.
In these days of nobody answering the phone, if you don't recognize the number,
Right. Yeah.
I think that's going to be a problem.
Yes.
Judy, I'm just wondering, it sounds like the biggest concern about the census being counting everyone would have to do with gateway cities and places that particularly immigrants might not get counted. And so I'm wondering, has the League come up with any particular plan, or will they be, to address that in particular?
That's part of what we're looking to work on. I have already reached out to some groups, civic groups, who do a lot of work in gateway cities to see how we can partner with them to help ensure getting that count out. One group I talked to, there's a group called Mass Counts, which has there's a number of like Mass Voter Table, which does a lot of work in gateway cities, et cetera. That is a coalition, and they've started like developing pledge cards in a number of different languages to use at tabling events, or like go to the bus depot as people are going to work and hand it to them, for them to fill in, to remind themselves. So we're seeking to find opportunities like that to have coalitions. We also just joined the state complete count committee, so we'll be seeing what other opportunities may come from that. But you keep your eyes peeled to our newsletters, et cetera, because as we have these opportunities develop, we'll make sure local leagues know about them. But local league standpoint, feel free to reach out to groups that you know in your communities also. And so it's immigrants, college students, and again, the one I was surprised about, the most undercounted group is children under the age of 6.
Judy Fenwick
Yeah.
and I attended I'll call it a seminar, which included a presentation by a woman who's with a group that tries to maximize the count, among other things, the counting of new immigrants or long-standing immigrants who haven't been counted before. And my understanding is that they're going to make paper forms available initially in 19 different languages. Then, when they haven't heard from you, there will be a follow-up mailing, but only in English.
Okay.
And then, if they haven't heard from you, they will have a group of government workers who will go door to door, attempting to get a response.
Oh, okay.
But one of the big problems is that the federal government, through the Commerce Department, has allocated only 40% of what they allocated for the last census to conduct this mammoth task. So there are many ways to get around the requirement of a fair, a complete and accurate count.
I don't know if she also talked about they are actively recruiting for census workers, and that's another thing I think they're concerned about also, is can they find enough people who can do that work too.
Right. I know the League of Women Voters is going to join in this effort.
Good, excellent.
And so are the library trustees. And we're hoping to reach out to the school department. We were thinking about all different groups that would have an interest in doing this kind of work on a volunteer basis.
Oh,
I've been a census enumerator.
oh, excellent.
I was a 2010 census enumerator here in Falmouth. We were hired in May of 2010 and were trained, and then for 3 or 4 weeks we went out, and I was just downtown Falmouth. There's a lot of people that don't want to be found. There's a lot of people that just didn't fill it out. There were elderly people that, just didn't get to it. So it's hard. And with the whole citizenship thing, I can't even imagine that would scare so many people, different populations. Scary. I have my doubts about it all.
I know there's a lot
And
of,
as for what you do as an enumerator, if anyone has about 3 or 4 weeks, you just, you ride around, and it comes out to about $15 an hour. But trying to find people sometimes is very difficult.
yeah, the point around, and this is where I encourage you to either listen to the webinar or find a way to bring in the community specialists for your area for the U.S. Census, because they can describe how the data will be put into the computer with, and this gets beyond mathematics, I understand, but they're putting it in a way that there's a little bit of variation around the data in terms of age and some other things like that. Not to change what the count looks like, but to make it so that you can't take a piece of data down on the most basic level and trace it back to an individual. So we all have these concerns, which I think are legitimate. It would help for all of us to understand how the Census Bureau is addressing those so that we can help educate people. Still watch, but educate people. The other part which was pointed out to us is that the fines are extraordinarily stiff for anybody in government to misuse that data. And it's like $250,000 fine in prison terms, I believe. So I think that's important also for us to understand again, to help communicate to people. And the data, the raw data is kept confidential. I believe it is for 70 years. So not to discount the concerns, but if we can collect the information, I think we can help other people understand it.
I just wanted to correct one thing Sylvia said. The initial mailing will be a letter. It won't be a form. And the letter is to inform you that there are 3 ways to complete the census. One is by your phone, if you've got a smartphone, by online, at a desktop, or by a paper form. And that paper form, they're not going to be blanketing the world with paper forms. They don't want paper. They want electronic. And the other thing that we learned, this was the Mass Association of Library Trustees meeting that we went to, was that the most challenging group to try and pin down for the census is mobile young adults. And that's going to be, if we can attract them to fill out the census on their phones, that's going to be one thing, but they're constantly on the move. And for me, that mobile young adult population is college students, and I'm still confused as where should they be counted. So I'm sure they'll be confused on where they should be counted too.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's something on the website about that, but I'm not clear on that either. I know Amherst, because I was talking with a league member in Amherst, because she's getting involved in educating, and the score in Falmouth in terms of I forget exactly what they call it, but the lower the number, the better. And Falmouth was like 12.5, which is about the average in the state, and our state is good in terms of responsiveness. You go to Amherst, and it's like 35 or 36. And I'm sure it's a lot to do because not responsiveness, yeah. It's not non-responsiveness, and I'm sure a lot of it has to do with the college students. Oh, we have another, yes?
Was there someone else?
Yeah.
I also work in libraries, just as a substitute, but I see an awful lot of people that don't use computers.
Yeah.
I see this as a major issue. They won't fill out paper, nobody's going to fill out. The young kids know how to use technology. They might not do it, but there's a lot of people who don't know how to do technology.
And that's why I know our town clerk is concerned about the elderly population, that they don't know how to use it. I don't think we probably have the problem as much, certainly where I live. I don't know about here on the Cape or out in the western Massachusetts, but there's some parts of the country that don't even have broadband. So that's another challenge that comes with the online form. But there will be other ways, but it's not a shoo-in, yeah.
Any other questions?
Not to get further down in the weeds on the mechanics, but my confidence in the census is being eroded by the discussion here. And I was thinking, though, it sounds like the way it's done is by hiring tens of thousands of people on the federal level who go out and collect this data. What role do our town officials who know who's living here? Michael Palmer knows our precincts and who's an inactive and an active voter, and social services and others know who the people are around town. Do they have a role, or are they a resource in making sure that we have a full count, or do we have to start all over with $15 an hour temporary help and figure out if we got everyone captured?
Your town clerk or your town election official is a key person who's already been working on this probably since 2016. I would recommend go to the Secretary of the Commonwealth website and look at, he's got a page in there, there's a page in there about the 2020 census. They've been providing information to as I understand it, but please look at that because I know I'm not going to capture it all. They've been going, they tell the Census Bureau, here are the blocks. They're kind of like, as I understand it, kind of your most minute subsection of that things will then get built up to build like your local precincts and your larger precincts. And they provide, based upon the town census information, who lives there, how many people live there, their address. They do a lot of verification. So a lot of the information you're thinking about, the town officials have been involved because you're right, they're the ones who know that. And then that gets aggregated at the state level, and then the state gives that to the census. And I guess the person enumerating, because you got lists, as I understand how it works. This address, you have to, at least my cousin was a census worker, she told me about this. They got a list of when it was all by form, et cetera, this last time and all times before. She just had a list. She had to, first of all, go verify all the addresses. And then after the forms were sent out, she had some role, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but going back to those addresses, I guess the ones that maybe didn't fill it in, to make sure that they had submitted the form. So there's a lot of that's already been put in place. The other resource that goes into that level of detail would be the Donahue Institute at UMass Boston. They're the partner with the Secretary of the Commonwealth, Secretary of the Commonwealth on this topic, and they have a whole program about how these maps are drawn, how the data is collected, how it's input, and so you can collect some more information there. So I was surprised when I started looking at it. There's been for 4 years now a lot going on to get ready for the census.
You may not know the answer to this, but when the forms have been mailed, they've been pretty much filled out with your information from, what your occupation is, how many people, all of that stuff. So you don't know when you go online if there'll be a form for you when you log into.
I don't know. No, I'm sorry, I don't know.
We just had town meeting in Falmouth, was that just last week? And a town meeting member stood up. It wasn't a question about census, but it was a question about, is anybody else a town meeting member here? Okay, so there was the question about nationality appears on the local census form that's mailed out every year by the town clerk. And the nationality question has been on our local town census form for decades. And I'm trying to remember which article it was that was under discussion. I think it was, oh yes, the social justice. Yeah, the resolution on immigration, social justice. And so there was a person who usually is very angry about things in town, fairly conservative, and she got up with the census form in her hand and said, I want this taken off of our local census form. So it may be, but it's still there, and a lot of people feel the need to fill in a blank form. So anyway. It's been there as long as he can remember, even before his time. So locally, we're not in hearing, yeah.
Yeah. But the Census Bureau does what the thing is, they do it every year, and it's a more in-depth by communities. And it's a very, very long form. And there they do collect. That's the one where, recall when this whole thing around citizenship question came up, that, I can't remember, it's some sort of community something form. And there they do get into much more detail about nationality, where you were born, whether you're a citizen, that type of thing. So, but that's not the U.S. census that's going, the Dyson 10-year census. I have to look at my town census form to see if that's on ours. I'm not sure if it is or not. Okay. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank all of you for coming and for good questions.